Alhamdulillah, Shadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. Praise be to God. I bear witness that there is no God but God, and He has no partners. Last khutbah, I actually spoke about a few verses in the Quran that speaks about the love of God, and we understood from those verses that the love of God is not like how we understand love in the general sense, which is usually very superficial, which is all about you give me something, then I like you. That is the kind of love that we know about. But these Quranic verses teach us that God's love is very transformative. It is about transforming us. And the way He expresses His love towards us is sometimes in multiple ways, by providing us guidance, by showing us what we are doing wrong, verses that point out our mistake. When God was rebuking the Prophet Muhammad also for the prohibitions that he was making, it was out of genuine mercy, forgiveness, and love towards his creature to correct him. So God's way of showing love is clearly outlined in the Quran, and it is not something very superficial where it's all about just giving and making you happy. God wants a true love is when somebody does things for us to change us for the better. When a father insists or a mother insists a child that I will not give you this, it may appear as very harsh and a lack of love, but maybe the parent is trying to do something that will benefit the child in the long run. So similarly, God's love is also a transformative love that is coming from Him to transform us to become the best. What does people who love us do? They want the best for us. They don't want anything. They don't want to give us temporary happiness. They want to give us permanent, something valuable, right? Sometimes the kids, they want to play games, they want to watch TV, but we say no, go and do your studies. Now obviously the child doesn't like that. You see, just like now how Raju told our little daughter there that come here for Jummah. So that's the way a parent shows their love for the child, because this is more beneficial. So whatever is the best for the child is what the parent will do. Similarly, God sometimes tells us things or commands us things which may appear like, oh, it's too hard for us, but no, it is for the best. So that is why God's love is the most purest form of love. Now the flip side to that is obviously getting the displeasure of God, the wrath of God, and God not loving you. That is something very dangerous and a big loss for all human beings, incurring the wrath of God. So just as the Quran teaches us about the love of God and how He expresses His love, the Quran also speaks about the wrath of God. Even during our 5-time prayers, we pray to God. This is something, so imagine the importance of the wrath of God. That is why we are reciting it in our Fatiha 5 times a day in each unit of our prayer. This is Surah 1 verse 7, Al-Fatiha. It says, the path of those whom you blessed, not of those who deserve the wrath, nor of the strayers. So just as God's blessing is important, not incurring His wrath is very important. So we have to look into the Quran to understand how we can avoid the anger or the wrath of God. Because see, for example, when we get angry with someone, it may be for very simple reasons. Somebody cut you off while you're driving, you get angry, agitated, you say something to that person on the road. Now this is anger just for 5-10 minutes or 20 minutes. Sometimes your boss treats you in a very negative way, so you get angry for a few days. But the wrath of God is very intense. That first of all, God obviously is not an entity that gets irritated over small things like us. So what provokes God to incur? How can He we put His wrath on a creature? You have to commit that kind of horrendous crimes, because God's nature is of mercy. God is the most merciful. the most merciful. I mean, you cannot, it's beyond your imagination. So, and most forgiving also. Right? God is the forgiver. One of his attribute is obviously the merciful, Ar-Rahim, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, and also Al-Ghafir, the forgiver. So it's his name, it's in his nature to forgive you. But God says in the Quran, while he is the most forgiving, the most merciful, that he condemns and his anger is upon certain individuals. So you have to imagine the most merciful being in this universe also can be angered by certain individuals and their behavior and their position, belief, etc., actions. So to get to provoke such anger from the most merciful entity, God, you must be of that low level creature. So that is why we pray 5 times a day in every unit. Do not put me in the path of those people who will incur your wrath. Because once you incur the wrath, you're finished, you're dead, you're over. It's game over for you in this world and in the hereafter. So this is why it's very important. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Show us a straight path, the path of those whom you blessed, not of those who deserved wrath. So how can we make sure that we do not belong to that category of people who incur the wrath of God? The Quran teaches us that. Many verses. But first we should understand the consequences of the wrath of God. What will happen to us if we incur God's wrath, God's anger? God first of all differentiates between two kinds of people. One, it's in Surah 3 verse 162. Is one who pursues God's pleasure the same as one who incurs wrath from God, and his destiny is hell, the most miserable abode. So God is saying that the person who is continuously working towards getting the Ridwan, the what you call the pleasure, pleasing God, he wants to please God, make God happy, right? Sometimes we bring some gifts to make someone happy. We do certain small gestures to make someone happy. Similarly, a creature or a believer or a servant of God who continuously looks for things to make to seek God's pleasure, God says the person of that character and a person who does things to incur the wrath of God, they are not the same, because one is definitely going to hell. So this is what God looks at as. You are either a person who seeks the pleasure of God, seeks to please Him, or you are a person who seeks to do things which will bring condemnation and the anger of God upon you. And God says, if you are one of the person who is looking to do things that are going to anger God, then you are definitely going to hell. So it is upon our responsibility to check our own actions, our own thoughts, our own beliefs, our own positions, to ensure that we do not incur the wrath of God. Because if you incur the wrath of God, that's the end of your life in this world and the hereafter. So consequences of wrath. What happens when we incur the wrath of God? God says that very clearly in a few verses. In Surah 20 verse 81, God says, eat from the good things we provide for you and do not transgress, lest you incur my wrath. Whoever incurs my wrath has fallen. So God says, transgressing His limits. There are certain limits that God has set. If you transgress, commit horrendous crimes, and you transgress these things, do not transgress, lest you incur my wrath. So you will end up incurring God's anger. And God says that when that happens, whoever incurs my wrath has fallen. So that is the end of that person, both in this world and the hereafter. In Surah 24 verse 9, God says, the fifth oath shall incur God's wrath upon her if he was telling the truth. This is in context of obviously a couple, accusing the other of infidelity or committing zina. God, and so imagine why God, you should think about it. When God speaks about making 4 promises, and the 5th oath being incurred, you shall invoke wrath upon this person. Why is that? Because that's the most worst thing that can happen to a person. That is the most worst thing. If you're a believer and you say that the woman is saying that I have not committed this mistake. So if I took 4 oaths that I have not committed. Now the 5th oath is that if I am still lying, that means the wrath of God be upon me. So that is why at that time everyone will say, okay, we accept it. Because that's the worst someone can bring upon themselves. If I say, I promise I have not done this crime, and if I am lying, may the wrath of God be upon me. As far as a believer is concerned, a believing community is concerned, that is the epitome of oath. Because if someone says, let God's wrath be upon me, that means he is bringing the worst, he is asking for the worst upon himself. So that is why God says, if someone claims to say that I let the wrath of God be upon me if I am lying, you shall leave that person and accept his testimony. You shall accept it, because that is the worst. So this tells us the gravity of God's wrath. That is the worst a person can bring upon themselves or himself. In Surah 9 verse 80, God says, whether you ask forgiveness for them or do not ask forgiveness for them, even if you ask forgiveness for them 70 times, God will not forgive them. This is because they disbelieve in God and His messenger. God does not guide the wicked people. So this is an example of God's anger. God calls Himself the most forgiving, the most merciful. Yet there is a verse in the Quran where God says, even if you ask for them forgiveness, not 1 time, not 2 times, even 70 times you ask for them, I will not forgive them. God categorically says, I will not forgive them. And He gives the reason for it is because they disbelieve in God and His messenger. God does not guide the wicked people. So that means they have incurred God's wrath. God is so angry with them that God will never forgive them. He categorically says, even God's messenger is saying, forgive them. He says no. And telling the messenger, even if you ask for 70 times for these people, no, I will still not forgive them. So it's a complete negative where God is completely saying forgiveness is not given to them. It's end. So this is the gravity of God's wrath. Imagine you being in a position where you are not going to be forgiven by God. The most forgiving of all in this entire universe is telling that you will not get forgiveness. So that's because they have chosen a path of total disbelief and idolatry. And obviously God does not forgive idolatry. So this is the consequences of incurring the wrath of God. Once you incur the wrath of God, that means you have no forgiveness. You are in a fallen state. You have lost everything. So from these verses we learn the importance, the gravity of the wrath of God and also the consequences. Now inshallah in the next khutbah we will look into what causes us to incur the wrath of God. Tubulullah. Alhamdulillah, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. Praise be to God. I bear witness that there is no God but God. He is one and He has no partners. So clearly the Quran teaches us that there are certain reasons why certain individuals incur the wrath of God. And why is it important for us to know? As a believer, it is important for us to know why people incur the wrath of God so that we can avoid the same mistakes. In Surah 2 verse 90, God says, miserable indeed is what they sold their souls for, rejecting these revelations of God out of sheer resentment that God should bestow His grace upon whomever He chooses among His servants. Consequently, they incurred wrath upon wrath. The disbelievers have incurred a humiliating retribution. See, when we read these verses, we just think, God is just angry. But the wrath of God is so powerful that it leads a person to complete destruction. Because God is not an angry entity. It is not His nature. He is a very merciful, kind, and loving and forgiving Creator. So if you have to be of that worst worst creature to incur his wrath. So that's why God says, miserable indeed what they sold their souls for rejecting these revelations. So God is expressing his love, mercy and compassion to the humankind by revealing guidance. He could do something else. He could just let us live the way we are and just leave us in the lurch and put all of us in hell, right? He has no specific benefit by taking us all back to his kingdom. But it is his mercy, his love, his kindness that he is giving us a second chance and giving us guidance to tell that, okay, back to me. So what people are doing? People are rejecting as if it means nothing. You see, they don't care. They don't understand the immense love and mercy that God is showing to us for giving us this guidance, but we are just throwing it under the bus. We don't care. Or we use it for our own benefit. Let me make some dollars with this. So this is what the humankind is doing when God is showing so much love and mercy towards the humankind. He sends us scriptures, he sends us messengers, he sends us signs, proofs to believe, to understand the purpose of our existence, to save our souls before we die off from this earth, but we take it very lightly. We have other things to do. So that is the problem. And sometimes we go to the extent of rejecting it completely and saying, no, I don't want this. So what happens? God says that these are the people who will incur wrath upon wrath from God. So this is something that we should avoid. We should avoid rejecting God's truth, revelations unjustly without reflecting on them, understanding them, being patient and appreciating the guidance that comes. So this is something that we have to be very careful about so that we do not incur the wrath of God. Now the other verse where God teaches us how people incur the wrath of God, and this is people who were among the believers. Wrath because of betraying God, his messenger and the believers. This is in Surah 8 verse 16. Anyone who turns back on that day except to carry out a battle plan or to join his group has incurred wrath from God, and his abode is hell. What a miserable destiny. This is in context of war where certain people will turn back. They were with the believers, they were with the messenger, they pledged to cooperate with the messenger, with the believers, etc. But on that day, they ran, they turned. So this is betrayal, right? This is betrayal of the worst kind. And that is why God is saying that they have incurred wrath of God upon them. The wrath of God is upon them. So we also as believers make a commitment to God and his messenger that we will be in this path regardless of what happens. We will continue to believe in God. We will not give up on submission. We will strive in the cause of God and things like that. So when we turn away from that, what are we doing? We are betraying God. We are cheating God basically. So you are making a commitment and then you are cheating. So obviously God is not going to be very happy with you, and that's what the Quran is telling us, that they have incurred the wrath of God. Now wrath means you are out of God's mercy and forgiveness. So that is another way where people end up incurring the wrath of God. Now there's another verse which speaks about wrath because of committing idol worship even when God's messenger is in their midst. This happened to the children of Israel. Imagine, the guidance is here, like right in front of you, because the messenger is among you. And yet the children of Israel committed idol worship the moment he left. So, is that God is going to be happy with that kind of behavior? Obviously not. So that is what the verse says in Surah 7 verse 152. Surely those who idolize the calf have incurred wrath from their Lord and humiliation in this life. We thus requite the innovators. So despite the message being there for them, despite guidance being given to them, despite a messenger of God being alive there, right in their midst, yet they committed idol worship. They innovated to commit. They insisted on committing idol worship. So that is why God says that his wrath is upon such people. That is the worst that can happen. It's the worst betrayal. Another instance where the Quran speaks about incurring God's wrath is killing a believer on purpose. This is in Surah 4 verse 93. God says, anyone who kills a believer on purpose, his retribution is hell, wherein he abides forever. God is angry with him and condemns him and has prepared for him a terrible retribution. So clearly, anyone who kills a believer on purpose, his retribution is hell. So if a person, an enemy of God, kills a believer on purpose, a believer on purpose will not kill another believer, but a disbeliever who kills a believer, a sincere, innocent soul who has submitted to God, that is the worst crime in the eyes of God, one of the worst crimes. And that is why God says, if someone kills a believing person, an innocent person like that who is a believer, God's wrath will be upon such people. God is angry with him and condemns him and has prepared for him a terrible retribution. Another instance where God speaks about people incurring his anger and wrath is allying ourselves with disbelievers. In Surah 5 verse 80, God says, you would see many of them allying themselves with those who disbelieve. Miserable indeed is what their hands have set forth on behalf of their souls. God is angry with them and consequently they will abide forever in retribution. So this is also another serious mistake that we should avoid. God says very clearly that we should not be allying with people who have chosen disbelief. There's maybe people who are very close to you in relationship. Maybe your own father, mother, sister, brother can be in this category. So if they have chosen to disbelieve over belief and they have decided to reject the truth regardless, and they are adamant on that, that means they have chosen disbelief. God has very clearly told us not to ally with them, not to associate with them and compromise our religion. God makes it very clear that once it becomes very evident to us that they have become disbelievers, they have chosen disbelief over belief, and there is no point of return for them, no reflection, and that will become very clear. Why? How you will know it? Very easy. They will start treating you very differently. That's how you will understand that this is a lost case. They have no interest in believing anymore. So once that is established, we are not to ally with such people. We should keep a distance from them. We may carry out certain responsibilities, but we are not supposed to ally with them. Why? Because God says that will incur God's wrath. We will incur God's wrath upon us if we do that. And in Surah 48 verse 6 he says, and he will requite the hypocrite men and women and the idol worshipping men and women, for they have harbored evil thoughts about God. Their evil will backfire against them, for God is angry with them, condemns them, and has prepared for them Jahannam. What a miserable destiny. So this is another reason, and obviously this is speaking about the hypocrite men and women and the idol worshipping men and women, for they have harbored evil thoughts about God. So harboring evil thoughts about God, committing idol worship, hypocrisy are some of the reasons that causes God's wrath to be upon us. Another good advice in the Quran that helps us immensely to avoid the wrath of God is choosing our friends very carefully. In Surah 58 verse 14, God says, have you known those who befriended people with whom God is angry? They neither belong with you nor with them. They deliberately swear lies. So God is clearly angry with people who reject submission and they blaspheme against God. They call God's messengers whatever names. There are some people who burn Qurans. They talk bad things about the Prophet. Many sins. These are clearly enemies of God. They have come to a point where they are totally fighting God. Because some people may not understand the Quran or religion or Islam or messenger or whatever, but they don't really care. They're like, let them believe whatever they want. But then there are people who would go above and beyond to attack the religion. They want to blaspheme against God. So some people may choose, no, it's okay, let's be, we can talk with them, we can be friendly, let me have chai with them, let me have pakoda with them. No. Very clearly the Quran says, once this person shows this kind of behavior, tata, goodbye, you have to do it, otherwise you will be in more bigger trouble, because you know that is not permitted. It's very clear. It says, have you noted those who befriended people with whom God is angry? Because they have clearly incurred God's anger. They're continuously blaspheming against God, saying things about God. Sometimes you see on internet what people are writing about God and messenger and prophet and all those things. Horrendous things are being written, and there are people who are associating with them. And this is very clearly condemned by God. So if we do not want to incur His wrath, we have to be very careful. God also says in Surah 13, O you who believe, do not befriend people with whom God is angry and who are hopelessly stuck in disbelief. They are just as hopeless as the disbelievers who are already in the graves. It's a very, very powerful verse, because God is comparing them with dead people. You see, living people is comparing, he's equating, not comparing, he's equating living people with dead people. That they are just as desponent. Like you tell them, what will happen if you go to someone's grave and talk to that person? Nothing will come, right? Because the person is dead, is under the ground. Similarly, so there are people walking on top of the ground who are just as like dead people. Nothing goes in. So that is why God says that do not befriend such people. When you know that they are hopelessly stuck, nothing is going in, and they are just like dead people in the ground, then God, in the graves, God says, you shall not ally with them, you shall not stay, because God is clearly angry with them. They are very much adamant of not believing in the truth. In Surah 59 verse 19, God says, do not be like those who forgot God, so He made them forget themselves. These are the wicked. So many such verses, God teaches us in multiple occasions what God dislikes. God clearly says in Surah 2 verse 276 that God dislikes every disbeliever guilty. God dislikes the aggressors. God dislikes injustice. So these are behaviors that we have to refrain from, to not incur the wrath of God. If we are indulging in committing injustice to someone, for example, you may think it is not a big deal, but it is a big deal. Holding the property of someone else, which is rightfully theirs, you don't want to give it to them, because even some people do this to their own siblings, holding someone's property, not giving it to them, stealing with them, or taking the property of orphans, eating that, spending it away. These are things that people do in real life. So this is injustice, right? You're taking somebody's haq and you're eating it up before and doing injustice to this person. God clearly dislikes it. And when someone does that, you're incurring God's wrath upon you. So this is another thing. Repelling people from the path of God and fighting during the sacred months. These are in God's eyes are sacrilege, major sacrileges. Oppression is worse than murder. Also, so these are many things that the Quran teaches us, that, and also saying things that you do not do. 61:3, most abominable in the sight of God is that you say what you do not do. So all these verses in the Quran tell us that such behaviors are condemned by God, injustice and many things in the Quran that teaches us. These are all good lessons for us to understand how to avoid the wrath of God. Because if the wrath of God befalls us, as God says in the Quran, that person has fallen. That is the end of that person's life in this world and the hereafter. They are condemned to hell. So may God protect us and guide us from all the acts, the acts and the beliefs and the thoughts and the actions that lead to the wrath of God. Akim as-salam.